Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Khan, a genetically engineered tyrant who was banished on a planet 15 years ago by James Kirk and the Enterprise. What seemed like a good planet at the time, but the planet next to it exploded and took the planet out of its orbit and kind of ruined it. He was stuck there for 15 years until just by chance, Chekhov and another officer go down there, find Khan, and Khan finds his way to get his revenge on James Kirk. Then he finds out about a powerful terraforming device named Genesis, which you put it on a planet and it reforms all the matter down to like its basic level and starts life, and you can basically rejuvenate an entire planet, but it will also kill everything that is on the planet. And Khan finds out about this and is on a mission to find that and get his revenge on Kirk. After the last film I reviewed, the first film in the Star Trek franchise, Star Trek the Motion Picture, Paramount Pictures realized, and I think most people realized, they needed a better movie for the sequel because the first one was pretty awful and boring. Producer of this film, actually, when executives put him in the room, said he thought it was boring also. And Gene Roddenberry was actually taken off this film after what they felt was kind of his fault for the first one. And this film feels like a way to really rejuvenate Star Trek. It's kind of like the first reboot of Star Trek. It's so different from the first film, and in the best way. It's more of a fun movie. It gets the fun of Star Trek. Wrath of Khan gets what makes Star Trek fun, a swashbuckling, handsome Kirk adventure. But instead, realizing that Shatner's a lot older, having the themes of age and death in here, and obviously if you really haven't seen Wrath of Khan, but, spoilers, I guess, but with Spock's death, Shatner himself was getting older. The whole cast was getting older. The first film acknowledges it, but I think a lot of the themes in the first film play a lot better in this film with the young crew, the training crew that's on the Enterprise, and with the original cast being a lot older, I think comes more into play and works more with the themes of the film. Mistakes of the past and dealing with old age and like what your life has become. And Khan has a lot to do with that because Khan was from the past. He was from 15 years ago. And it plays into the series a lot more because Khan's a villain from the original series. I actually watched the original episode before watching the movie, and it makes a lot more sense, particularly the deal with his wife, who was actually a member of the Enterprise before. I think this film gets all the best intentions on making themes that are much like big blockbuster movie themes. They're very present, they're very there, but at the same time there's a certain elegance, and especially in this movie there's a certain elegance to doing those themes in that way. So they're very upfront and center, and you really get the whole thing with Kirk and age and like how they've come to this point, and the mistakes they've made in life and what their relationship is at this point, and Kirk realizing he has a son is another thing. This is as much about Kirk as it is about Khan. And Khan is interesting also because he has a lot of regrets in his life and how his life has turned out. This film takes from the Moby Dick plotline. He's like Captain Ahab and his white whale is Kirk, and he doesn't really care, at a certain point, that he's basically won and he doesn't give a shit. He wants to take down Kirk. That's his big character flaw, is that he will do that, but it makes him an interesting villain. And even though he's a very personal villain, that's really something that works well in any sequel film, because after you introduce the characters, and obviously that was another thing that sucks about making these Star Trek movies based on a TV series, is you already know the film, so they're essentially all sequels in a weird way. You don't have your first Iron Man, you don't have your first Star Trek like in the rebooted franchise where you can introduce everybody, and you can have a film that's more about the heroes. Every sequel, if you look at James Bond, if you look at Iron Man or constant other franchises, they're far more about the villains than the heroes at a certain point. The villain has to be really good. Look at Skyfall. Skyfall had a great villain. Javier Bardem plays an amazing villain in that, and a personal villain, and he cared more about taking down James Bond. He was a different villain from the previous films. Villains who had like their own agendas on a personal vendetta, a Moby Dick type, Captain Ahab type vendetta. Ricardo Montalban's character of Khan has that so in there. And what's really interesting about this character and the dynamic between him and Kirk is they actually never shot scenes together. There's never a scene with them face to face. they're doing this through view screens, but I think this relationship has become so monumentally influential throughout what's become franchise filmmaking in Hollywood. I think Wrath of Khan is the real Star Trek film that has an influence, because look at X-Men. X-Men 2 borrows so much from this movie. I mean, look at the whole death of Jean Grey, and then Famke Janssen does that whole monologue at the end, which is almost identical to what Leonard Nimoy does when he dies in this film. Even the whole ending that seems a lot hammier in X-Men 2 than this film, it works more with the themes, and there are things that really need to end, and it does feel a little bit long. X-Men 2, it feels worse. Bryan Singer admits it and even says if he had made a sequel to Superman Returns, which I wouldn't ever want to see, but he apparently said that was going to be based on Wrath of Khan. Even the Star Trek reboot owes a lot, and I'm probably the Star Trek Into Darkness, but I haven't seen that yet. But the first film owes a lot to this film as well, because Eric Bana's character is very similar to Khan, and they even have the Kobayashi Maru sequence in this film that they talk about, that Savick is always asking Kirk about throughout the whole film, is in the Star Trek reboot. And Wrath of Khan has become this big influence on everyone because it kind of revigorated the franchise for Star Trek. Wrath of Khan, to me, was always the film that I always looked at as the beginning of that franchise, because Star Trek Search for Spock is obviously a direct sequel to this, and then The Voyage Home is. And I think they even acknowledge Search for Spock in 5, so it's like really started the whole continuity of this franchise. It is kind of more a fun movie. It's more of a cool sci-fi movie, and most of the criticism I've read about it was like, at least this movie's fun, at least I had a good time. You know, this is the thing I want from Star Trek. And I even think Shatner's performance is a lot stronger because he has something to play off of. He has a theme, he has a real arc for his character to go off of, and I love Ricardo Montalban. I like Ricardo Montalban anyway. I think he's a cool actor. He did a lot of good feature film work. He admits this is probably one of the highlights in his career. That Captain Ahab idea really comes from Wrath of Khan. I think a lot of blockbuster films, when they're trying to do a villain like this, they're always looking back at Ricardo Montalban's portrayal and this film. When you look at Wrath of Khan and why it has meant so much, I think it reaches you on an emotional level, and that's something that when you have a personal vendetta and you don't have these big, like, I'm going to conquer the universe, ha ha ha, evil stuff, that doesn't represent as much. That doesn't represent a real emotion, because most people you know, don't go through that. You have to have a villain who, they want to do that, but they have some personal vendetta. Look at even the Avengers with Loki. I watched it as a kid a lot, and I think I watched this one more than any other of the Star Trek films. And this and Search for Spock and Voyage Home, it was kind of like the trilogy. They all represent kind of a similar arc, with specifically with Spock. For a kid who is addicted to Star Wars, this is a good transition film. I think it's a good, because it's not too heavy. I really disagree with when you want to get someone into something, you show them like the heaviest shit imaginable. Like, you show them the transition film, much like how the Star Trek reboot was able to get people into Star Trek who would never watch it. I think this is the same way, where you can look at Wrath of Khan and you can get into Star Trek and you can have a good time, and you're not, you know, it represents something to the original series, and but it's also, I think it's really well written, it's really well done. James Horner's score is just one of the best James Horner scores. I've never been a huge fan of him, and I'm not exactly sure why, because when I watch this film, it's just like some of the things he does with the scenes, how important his score is to this film. And that scene where Kirk is running to see Spock, and the strings are like really high, the high notes, and it's like really building and everything. When I was watching that, I was like, oh my god, this is so important to this scene. Like, that, my whole feeling since I was a kid for that is so wrapped up in that score, that James Horner score, and he does so much. It's such a great score. It's probably my favorite score I've ever heard for a Star Trek movie, and just an incredible fucking score. I mean, it is the closest I've seen to a similar kind of John Williams Star Wars score. It just, I can't even imagine this film without it. You know, it's probably the most important thing in this film. There is good acting. I actually like the effects, some people don't, but this James Horner score is just so tied into the emotions of these characters, and he brings it out and brings it in such a mainstream way that I loved about the original Star Wars score. And the scores of this era and the blockbuster era, when they're done right, is to really emphasize the emotion and the themes, and I think James Horner's score absolutely does that. I've always thought of this as the best Star Trek film, and it's an important film because of how influential it is, and the personal villain idea of it, I think any film that's been made as a sequel that has a personal villain like this, you have to look back at Wrath of Khan. And the fact that it's very influential on the Star Trek franchise, it's very influential on several other franchises. And it's even kind of like Empire Strikes Back, where it tries to represent everything that the previous film isn't. Within 2 years, you have the 2 sequels that when you hear interviews with filmmakers, they're like, well, what's this sequel going to be like, eh? They're always like Wrath of Khan, Empire Strikes Back, or the 2, the gold standard. And this is not as good as Empire Strikes Back. This broke the mold in a way like, let's just make a really fun, cool Star Trek movie that everyone who loved the series will really get into. The Spock death, watching it now, it does feel a little random. It does feel like, oh, let's just pack this on. But it does work within the themes. It still means a lot to me, but it does feel like he's like, well, I better go do this. Turn around, go die, sacrifice myself for the ship. It does feel a little random, but I always get almost a little teary every time I watch it. So I always like Wrath of Khan personally, but I think this is a damn good sequel, one of the best sequels ever made, and still my favorite Star Trek film. Both great entertainment and good filmmaking, and that's really what I think blockbusters should be, and this Star Trek II Wrath of Khan totally fulfills that. So if you have seen Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And check out my review for Star Trek The Motion Picture if you haven't already. And my next video will be Star Trek Into Darkness, and I hope to see you then to check that out. And that's about it.